McGrory, will you please convene the Committee on Audit?
Thank you, Chairman Day. Will the Committee on Audit please come to order? We will now hear public comment from those who signed up to address agenda items coming before the Committee on Audit today. Today we have 2 requests for public comment. Each speaker will have 1 minute. The speakers are Leland Wessel and Tessie Reese.
Dr. Wessel has left and Tessie passes. Thank you. That's quick.
Thank you very much. It's now time for the committee to consider today's consent agenda. Would any member wish to remove any of the items for separate discussion? May I have a motion to approve all the items listed on the consent agenda?
So moved.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Any abstentions? The committee has 2 items on today's discussion agenda. Item 3 of the discussion agenda is an information item regarding status report on the California State Auditor report on accounts outside the state treasury and campus parking programs. The item will be presented by Larry Mandel, Vice Chancellor and Chief Audit Officer. Larry?
Thank you, Chair McGrory. In June 2019, the California State Auditor issued its report on the California State University's financial accounts held outside the state treasury and campus parking programs. As discussed at the July Committee on Audit meeting, the CSU is committed to implementing all 8 recommendations in the report. The state auditor requires follow-up responses 60 days, 6 months, and 1 year after a report is issued. The system's 60-day follow-up response was submitted to the state auditor on August 19th and is included in your agenda packet as attachment A. In the 60-day response, the CSU asserted the full implementation of 1 of the 8 recommendations, and although the state auditor acknowledged the examples we provided were exactly what they were looking for, they want to see more repetition. As a result, we will need to provide additional examples as they become available. Work on the remaining 7 recommendations is currently in process. The Joint Legislative Audit Committee held a hearing in Sacramento on August 12th to discuss the audit report. Chancellor White, Trustee McGrory, and CSU executives participated in the hearing. Trustee Furstenberg also traveled to Sacramento to attend the hearing. Chancellor White and Trustee McGrory addressed legislators and were able to dispel any notion that the CSU concealed funds from stakeholders. The state auditor also confirmed this fact. Trustee McGrory emphasized that maintaining adequate reserves is an essential fiscal practice, while also noting that the CSU should revisit its reserve policy using the audit report as guidance. The need for the CSU to maintain sufficient designated reserve funds was affirmed, and legislators appreciated the system's commitment to implementing all of the audit report recommendations. It was also acknowledged during the hearing that the CSU needs to conduct a more comprehensive analysis of parking and alternative transportation programs. The next follow-up response, the 6-month response, will be due to the state auditor in December. Chair McGrory, this concludes my presentation.
Let me just add a couple of comments on the state auditor's report and our discussion up in Sacramento. I think it's unfortunate what's happened here, and I've seen it happen before in other public agencies. There's one form of accounting called GAAP accounting, and a lot of the state auditor's report focused on GAAP and the annual audit statements. There's another form of financial reporting. It's your normal financial budget, and in our budget, I think in some ways it's unfortunate. We have $1.7 billion of what's called designated reserves. Those designated reserves break down to 3 categories. One category, which is about $814 million, are short-term obligations. These are purchase orders, contracts that have been awarded, cash is sitting there waiting to be paid against those obligations. That's $814 million. Those are commitments that we have to, they're encumbrances. Although the cash is there, it's not a normal reserve. It's a designated reserve to pay short-term obligations. There's another category of reserve called capital reserve, which is $356 million. This reserve is for capital projects that the campuses have identified, have allocated money towards, Cash is sitting there against those projects until all the funding can be put together. That's called a capital reserve. The real reserve, the rainy day reserve, which is comparable to the state of California's rainy day reserve, is $500 million. That's where I think the focus should be of this discussion. What is the appropriate reserve for emergencies that we should have within the system? The auditor recommended that we have a minimum reserve. Right now, that $500 million reserve gets us 3 weeks of operating time. If we got in trouble, we got a reserve that would take care of us for 3 weeks. The normal reserve policy calls for an operating reserve, an emergency reserve, of somewhere between 3 and 6 months. Our policy right now says the maximum reserve we should have is 6 months. It does not call for a minimum reserve. The auditor is recommending that we set a minimum reserve policy. The problem with doing that is it takes away some of our flexibility. And we would be telling the chancellor to increase probably to 3 months and add another $1 billion to the $500 million emergency reserve we have. That's the real reserve we have. The other reserves are encumbrances, they're contractual obligations, or they're capital projects that have been identified by the campuses. The cash may be sitting there someplace, and if you swept it all up, you'd have $1.7 billion, but it's been earmarked for other programs that have been approved in the budget that we approve every year. The real reserve is $500 million. That's where the focus should be. What is the appropriate level for that $500 million appropriate emergency reserve? I'm not sure we want a minimum reserve, because when we get into that discussion, we're going to be talking about increasing the reserve substantially. It's not a good place to go at this point. And I just want to make sure that that's clear. We are going to comply with all of the recommendations in the report. We will bring back a reserve policy for the board's consideration with the chancellor at our next meeting, and we are available to answer any questions. We also have parking recommendations along with the reserve policy that are in the report, and we will be implementing those recommendations. Okay, let me take the speakers now.
I'm just curious to know, when you have unspent dollars on campus, who designates the category where those monies goes to, or are they predetermined?
The priority capital improvement projects that the campuses have worked out with the chancellor's office.
Okay, so it's predetermined if you have unspent.
Yeah, and the example I used with the legislature was that when I was in my prior life with San Diego State, we built a science building, and a third of it came from the campus, a third came from philanthropic fundraising, and a third came from the chancellor's office from Long Beach. The third that we had to put in, $35 million, we allocated from reserves over a period of 2 or 3 years till we got to the point we had the $35 million. That's what's in those capital reserves, projects like that. Chairman Day?
I'll be brief. I just want to thank you, Trustee McGrory, for what you just said, and I fully associate myself with your comments. I've said publicly before on this issue what I believe in, and I want to thank you also and the Chancellor for taking the time to travel to Sacramento and respond to the Joint Committee. I think your presence there and your responses were very informative and helpful, and I think corrected a lot of the misinformation that was the result of the audit, and unfortunately was spread, unfortunately. So I wanted to say thank you on behalf of the board.
Trustee McGregor, I want to ask you whether, well, first of all, I agree with your classification, but I just wonder whether the state auditor would agree with that classification. Because from my vantage point, it appears that its appearance that, how would I say, has dominated the narrative and not reality from my vantage point. So have we had a conversation with or communication with the state auditor that would recognize your reclassification?
I think because we're following different types of financial and accounting principles, we end up at a different place. And so when she looks at the annual audited statement for the whole system, she sees $4.5 billion in cash, and that's the way you have to report it. But that gets broken down, and then you finally end up with $1.7 billion in designated reserves. And then when you break those things down, you really have a $500 million rainy day reserve. And I don't know that she's going to agree with that. We made our presentation to the legislative committee. She was there. She made her presentation. They gave her a chance to respond to our presentation. She didn't. I think we're just looking at this issue from different eyes.
Right, and I think there should be some communication with the state auditor about this, or perhaps because if we were to increase through our proposed policy or policy we come up with to enhance the the 500 million further, that further exacerbates the perception, the negative perception that somehow has dominated this narrative, unfortunately, in the press.
I agree. I know Larry Mandel is in constant communication with the state auditor's office over these recommendations and the implementation of those recommendations. We could have another conversation with the state auditor to see if she, where she's at on our reserves issue. We probably should before the November meeting, so we're not running afoul of what she would like us to do. But the classification of those reserves is critical to this discussion.
That would be helpful.
Thank you, and thank you again for you traveling to Sacramento and speaking at that hearing. I just want to voice my concern again about the precarious position that I think we're in with having a 3-week reserve. I think that puts us in the shoes of 50% of Americans who can't come up with $400 if something happens. And I don't think that's where we want to be. And I understand optics and perception are always important and something that we in the real world have to deal with, but we are fiduciaries for this great organization. And if something or when some other possibly catastrophic economic event happens, we don't want to be in the position of in 3 weeks have no reserves to keep things going.
Okay. Trustee Taylor?
Thank you, Trustee McGrory, and thank you for the clarity you offered. I think it helps a great deal. I'm very uncomfortable with 3 weeks of reserves. Keep in mind, this is not just in case of economic downturns, and CFO Relier, maybe you can correct me. If there's a massive earthquake and one of our campuses go down, this is our primary source of liquidity in order to get that campus stood back up so we don't have to close a campus for a year or two while we rebuild it. I'm just very uncomfortable with only $500 million of reserves. I think, whereas maybe in higher education, there's not a clear standard. Is it 3 months, 6 months? It's clearly more than 3 weeks. And so I'm hoping we can come up with a reserve policy and slowly over time talk about how we can get ourselves in a position to make sure that we have that rainy day fund just like the state of California does.
Trustee Garcia?
Yeah, I was just wondering if there was a specific deadline by which we had to implement the recommendations, because I know the response is due in December, but the estimated completion dates of some of these recommendations, actually, all of them are in 2019 except for one, which is in 2020. So I was just wondering if there was a deadline by which we had to complete them.
As we complete them, we submit them to the state auditor over a period of time, and they respond back as to whether they feel they're totally completed or not, or partially completed, and tell us what they think that we need to do. And it's a constant back and forth between this office and the state auditor.
Okay, so there's no set deadline.
There's no set deadline. There are reports that come out from the state auditor on an annual basis that will say which state agencies are still out of compliance.
Okay.
And so that's kind of your deadline.
Any other speakers? Okay, that concludes this item, and we'll bring back a policy in November. Item 4, the discussion agenda is an information item regarding status report on consideration of opportunities for continued program enhancement of the institutional control environment. The item will be presented by Larry Mandel, Vice Chancellor and Chief Audit Officer.
Thank you, Chair McCrory. At the July 2019 meeting of the Committee on Audit, the report on the results of the Quality Assessment Review of the California State University System Internal Audit Program was presented. The review resulted in a rating of CSU's internal audit function as generally conforms, which is the highest of 3 possible ratings. This opinion means the policies, procedures, and practices are in place to implement the standards and requirements necessary for ensuring the independence, objectivity, and proficiency of the internal auditing program. The peer review also produced 4 observations and recommendations for continued program enhancement related to the institutional control environment. These are things that each member of the review team has seen in action at their own university or others that can further elevate a high-performing audit function. The review team was cognizant of the control environment at the CSU because of the effect it can have on audit work. This category includes suggestions that are not meant to imply the existence of concern or issues. They are simply opportunities that may enhance the program. The first opportunity outlined in the report relates to a system-wide code of ethics. Although it is correct that the CSU does not have a single overarching code of ethics, there are an extensive set of ethics-related laws and policies that the CSU must follow that govern the ethical conduct of employees. Nonetheless, the CSU senior leadership is considering adopting a system-wide statement on ethical values and expectations. The second opportunity outlined in the report relates to a whistleblower hotline. A number of institutions have implemented a whistleblower hotline in order to provide a mechanism for complaints, anonymous or otherwise, to be made through one central communications channel, which helps with consistency and handling of reports. A third-party hotline could also provide complainants with greater assurance that their identity, whether or not it is disclosed to the third-party hotline, will be protected. While the CSU does not have a system-wide reporting hotline to receive whistleblower complaints or allegations of improper governmental activities, both system-wide policies and procedures and the California State Auditor's whistleblower hotline provide mechanisms for complaints, anonymous or otherwise. Executive Order 1115, Complaint Procedures for Protected Disclosure of Improper Governmental Activities and/or Significant Threats to Health or Safety, outlines the procedures for making protected disclosures and, among other things, allows third-party and anonymous complaints. The procedure is available to anyone, employees, students, and third parties, wishing to make a verbal or written complaint and applies system-wide to all campuses and the Chancellor's office. The identity of complainants is protected and the process is accessible. System-wide Human Resources is the office responsible for overseeing and administering the whistleblower policy. Additionally, the California State Auditor maintains a whistleblower hotline where complaints pertaining to the CSU may be made. State agencies, including the CSU, are required to inform employees about the State Auditor's whistleblower hotline. Complainants may file with the State Auditor via their toll-free hotline, online complaint form, or by mail. Senior leadership is conducting an assessment of the costs and benefits associated with implementing an internal third-party whistleblower hotline in addition to the State Auditor's whistleblower hotline. The third opportunity outlined in the report relates to a system-wide institutional compliance function. CSU's decentralized model for compliance is fairly common in higher education. In the CSU model, each disparate area of compliance is managed by specialized subject matter experts. The compliance function for the system is dispersed throughout the various divisions of the Office of the Chancellor. However, some organizations have implemented a system-wide compliance function and/or have identified an institutional compliance officer to support communication, coordination, training, and risk monitoring across the campuses. This would not include the centralized handling of compliance matters. Rather, it would serve as a mechanism for further support existing compliance functions system-wide. Senior leadership is considering performing a gap analysis to determine if there are any significant compliance areas that do not have adequate system-wide coverage. Additionally, such a gap analysis could further ensure that critical risks are being properly managed by the appropriate individuals. The fourth and final opportunity outlined in the report refers relates to referring cases involving employees suspected of criminal wrongdoing for prosecution. The report recommended development of a system-wide policy with guidelines for referring cases for prosecution, so similar cases will be handled the same regardless of jurisdiction. This recommendation has been implemented. At the May 2019 meeting of the Board of Trustees, both the Committee on Audit and full board approved a resolution containing guidelines and requirements for referring cases for prosecution. Management is in the process of implementing these guidelines and requirements. Chair McGrory, this concludes my presentation.
Thank you. So I think the two remaining issues, the two biggest issues for the board at some point, probably within the next meeting, is should we have an ethics policy in addition to what is provided for by state government? And should we have a system-wide whistleblower hotline? So we'll bring those back at the next meeting. Are there any questions? Chairman Day, that concludes the business of the Audit Committee.
Thank you, Trustee McGrory.